China filed 1.8 million patents in 2024. The United States Senate spent 7 hours questioning social media executives about TikTok. Those events happened in the same strategic environment. They describe two different theories of power. One system is scaling engineering output. The other is treating attention management as national defense. And before someone objects, yes, patent quantity alone can mislead. A large share of Chinese filings are incremental. Some are defensive. Some will never become products. That's true. But the contradiction survives contact with the nuance, because the deeper issue isn't the raw patent number. It's where state capacity is being directed. In 2000, the United States produced roughly 37% of global manufacturing output in advanced industries. China produced less than 7%. By 2024, according to UNIDO and World Bank industrial data, those positions had effectively inverted across multiple sectors that matter most: batteries, solar, telecom infrastructure, shipbuilding, rare earth refining, commercial drones, and increasingly mature semiconductor nodes. Which creates an awkward question for Washington. If China is supposedly technologically fragile, why does every sanctions package require emergency carve-outs for American companies? NVIDIA wanted export controls softened because China represented billions in revenue. ASML warned restrictions could accelerate indigenous Chinese lithography efforts. Apple still depends on Chinese manufacturing ecosystems that took 3 decades to assemble. Even Tesla's most productive factory sits in Shanghai. The dependency graph keeps leaking through the rhetoric. That gap has a name. We'll get to it. Start with engineering scale. China graduates roughly 4 times more STEM students annually than the United States. The Ministry of Education reported over 5 million STEM graduates in recent cycles, depending on classification methodology. America's comparable pipeline is nowhere close. Meanwhile, China's industrial robot installations accounted for more than half of all global installations in recent International Federation of Robotics reports. Not half of Asia, half of Earth. Those numbers matter because innovation doesn't emerge from slogans. It emerges from iteration density. More engineers, more factories, more supply chain proximity, more opportunities to fail cheaply and try again by Tuesday morning. Silicon Valley still dominates frontier software and foundational AI models. That's real. America's research universities remain extraordinary. Venture capital depth still matters. But the industrial layer underneath the software stack has thinned out enough that Washington increasingly confuses invention with production capacity. They're not the same thing. The iPhone is designed in California. The precision tooling, battery chemistry scaling, rare earth processing, component clustering, and assembly optimization happen overwhelmingly in Asia, heavily concentrated in China, which means the most profitable company in America still relies on ecosystems America no longer fully controls. And the political response has drifted towards symbolism, because symbolism performs better on television than rebuilding machine tool capacity in Ohio over 15 years. Congress can threaten TikTok in a news cycle. Rebuilding advanced supply chains requires patient capital, immigration reform, energy abundance, engineering education, port modernization, grid expansion, and labor strategies that survive election cycles. One generates clips by dinner. The other takes a decade before voters notice. So the incentives skew toward spectacle. Look carefully at the timing. In the same period Washington escalated public anxiety around TikTok, China's BYD overtook Tesla in quarterly EV sales. Huawei returned with 7-nanometer class smartphone chips, despite sanctions designed specifically to prevent that outcome. CATL expanded battery dominance. DJI continued controlling the global commercial drone market at levels Western regulators openly describe as a strategic concern. The stated objective of sanctions was technological containment. The measurable outcome was accelerated domestic substitution inside China. There's dry humor buried in that. Washington spent years arguing China couldn't innovate without Western systems. Then, sanctions forced China to build parallel systems faster. That's one way to run an industrial policy for your competitor. The more uncomfortable implication sits underneath all of this. America's political class still talks like technological leadership is permanent. China's bureaucracy behaves like leadership is rented and expires without constant reinvestment. Different assumptions produce different behavior. And once you see that, the TikTok hearings stop looking isolated. They start looking diagnostic. The CHIPS and Science Act authorized roughly $52 billion. Between 2001 and 2023, the United States lost more than 90,000 manufacturing facilities. One policy was announced as a national industrial revival. The other number describes the terrain it landed on. Because the mechanism underneath this story isn't simply China invested more. Countries can spend enormous sums and still fail. India has learned that repeatedly in electronics manufacturing. Europe is learning it now in batteries. Money matters less than system design. Specifically, whether the institutions involved are rewarded for long-term productive capacity or short-term political visibility. China built a machine optimized for industrial accumulation. America built one optimized for financial extraction. That's the mechanism. Look at corporate incentives first. In 1980, roughly 2% of S&P 500 cash flow went to stock buybacks. By the late 2010s, buybacks regularly exceeded investment in R&D across major sectors. Apple alone spent hundreds of billions repurchasing shares over the past decade. Intel spent enormous sums on buybacks during years when Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company was widening the fabrication lead that now threatens Intel's entire position. The market rewarded the buybacks immediately. The manufacturing decline arrived slowly enough that executives could retire before consequences appeared. That's not corruption in the cinematic sense. It's incentive alignment. Quarterly earnings outperformed 10-year industrial planning in systems built around shareholder acceleration. China structured incentives differently. Provincial governments compete for factory clusters. State banks tolerate longer timelines. Land access, grid expansion, logistics corridors, and export financing often move in coordinated blocks. The National Integrated Circuit Industry Investment Fund, what people call the Big Fund, directed tens of billions into semiconductor development despite repeated inefficiencies and corruption scandals. And yes, there was waste, a lot of it. Some firms collapsed outright. But Beijing tolerated inefficient spending because redundancy itself was part of the strategy. America treats redundancy as inefficiency. China treats redundancy as insurance. That distinction matters when supply chains fracture. During the pandemic, the United States discovered it couldn't rapidly produce enough basic medical equipment without Chinese inputs. Masks, pharmaceutical precursors, industrial chemicals, semiconductor packaging materials. Entire procurement chains stalled because lean optimization had removed slack from the system. Wall Street loved the efficiency metrics right up until hospitals started bidding against each other for nitrile gloves, which is what makes the semiconductor conversation so revealing. Washington talks about chips like they're isolated objects. They're ecosystems. A cutting-edge fab requires ultra-pure chemicals, precision optics, advanced packaging, stable electricity, water infrastructure, engineering labor, component suppliers, and tool maintenance networks operating simultaneously at absurd tolerances. TSMC didn't emerge because Taiwan held a press conference about strategic competition. It emerged because Taiwan spent 40 years aligning education, infrastructure, and industrial policy around one target. America is now trying to compress that timeline into election cycles. The Arizona TSMC facility illustrates the problem perfectly. The project faced delays tied to skilled labor shortages, permitting complexity, supply coordination issues, and higher construction costs than equivalent builds in Taiwan. So Taiwanese engineers were flown in to stabilize operations. Officially, this was temporary expertise transfer. In practice, America's flagship reshoring project required imported industrial culture to function on schedule. This is called domestic revitalization. Meanwhile, China kept expanding mature node semiconductor production. The chips used in cars, appliances, industrial systems, military hardware, and power management. Less glamorous than frontier AI accelerators, more economically foundational. By 2025, Chinese firms were projected to control major shares of global mature node output because Beijing understood something Washington still struggles with. Dominance at the boring layers creates leverage over everything built on top. You don't need the world's best chip to pressure supply chains. You need enough of the chips every machine depends on. And here's where the cost gets transferred to ordinary people. When industrial capacity leaves a country, wages don't collapse immediately. The decline arrives indirectly. Communities lose technical depth. Apprenticeship pipelines shrink. Supplier networks disappear. Productive work gets replaced by logistics work, then service work, then debt-supported consumption disconnected from local production. The economy still looks wealthy because financial markets inflate asset prices. But the productive middle begins hollowing out underneath. China's rise didn't create that hollowing by itself. It exposed decisions America already made. What I keep coming back to, and this is where I'll stake something, is how often Washington frames technological competition as a morality play instead of a systems competition. Politicians talk as if banning platforms or restricting exports automatically regenerates industrial depth. But restrictions can slow competitors only if the restricting country is simultaneously expanding its own productive base. Otherwise, sanctions become admissions of dependency. Huawei is the uncomfortable example. The company was targeted with one of the most aggressive technology restriction campaigns in modern history. Access to advanced chips, software ecosystems, and supplier networks was cut. American officials expected collapse. Instead, Huawei redirected resources into domestic substitution, developed operating system alternatives, expanded internal R&D, and re-emerged in strategically important sectors faster than many analysts predicted. Not untouched, not dominant everywhere, but alive and increasingly independent. That outcome matters because it reveals who absorbed the pressure. American suppliers lost revenue. Chinese firms accelerated internal capability development. Consumers paid higher costs. The strategic dependence Washington hoped to preserve weakened anyway. And once that cycle starts repeating across batteries, robotics, telecom equipment, aviation components, and industrial AI, the picture changes. Restrictions stop looking like containment. They start looking like transition costs for a world splitting into parallel technological systems. One optimized around finance, one optimized around production. The verdict comes later, but the mechanism is already visible. National security officials are not imagining the threat. China's military-civil fusion strategy is real. That's the strongest version of the American argument, and it deserves to be stated cleanly before anything else. Beijing does use commercial technology development for state power projection. The People's Liberation Army works directly with civilian firms. Chinese law can compel corporate cooperation with state intelligence services. Cyber espionage campaigns tied to Chinese actors have targeted American aerospace, semiconductor, telecom, and defense sectors for years. TikTok data concerns are not invented out of thin air. Neither are concerns around Huawei infrastructure. If you stop the analysis there, aggressive technological restrictions sound rational, maybe even overdue. And for a while, Washington believed the evidence supported that strategy. Cut China off from advanced lithography systems, restrict high-end GPUs, block software tooling, limit access to Western capital markets, slow the climb, preserve the lead. The theory was coherent. Then the numbers started refusing to cooperate. Huawei returned to the premium smartphone market using domestically produced 7-nanometer class chips. SMIC advanced fabrication capability despite export controls specifically designed to freeze it below that threshold. China's EV sector didn't weaken under pressure. It expanded aggressively into Europe, Southeast Asia, Latin America, and parts of the Middle East. BYD passed Tesla in quarterly electric vehicle sales while remaining vertically integrated across batteries, manufacturing, and supply chain management. And the most uncomfortable data point of all may be this. China increased research and development spending throughout the sanctions period. According to OECD and Chinese government reporting, national R&D expenditure crossed levels approaching European Union totals combined in several strategic sectors. Restrictions did not reduce the political priority of technological independence. They increased it, which forces a harder question. What exactly was the sanctions regime optimizing for? Because if the objective was permanent dependency on Western systems, the evidence points the other direction. Take semiconductor equipment. ASML's extreme ultraviolet lithography systems remain unmatched globally. America still dominates critical software tooling and advanced chip architecture. Taiwan and South Korea remain central to leading-edge manufacturing. Those are genuine advantages. The counter-argument says time still favors the West because frontier complexity compounds. China may replicate yesterday's nodes, but tomorrow's frontier keeps moving. That's the strongest serious case, and it's not stupid, but it leaves out scale dynamics that change how technological competition actually works in practice. A country does not need immediate dominance at the frontier to become economically dangerous. It needs sufficient capability across broad industrial layers, combined with enough domestic market scale to finance iteration. China's internal market gives firms something Western analysts consistently underestimate: protected repetition volume. Tesla learned manufacturing partly through scale. So did Amazon Logistics. So did Toyota. Repetition creates competence faster than theory does. China now has that repetition layer across drones, batteries, telecom hardware, solar infrastructure, EVs, industrial robotics, and increasingly commercial aerospace components. DJI controls most of the global commercial drone market, not because Western engineers are less intelligent. The company iterated products inside a manufacturing ecosystem capable of compressing development cycles brutally fast. Suppliers sat nearby, components moved quickly. Failures got corrected in weeks instead of quarters. America still produces world-class invention. China increasingly produces world-class industrialization. Those are different strengths. Washington keeps responding as though only the first one matters. What this tells me, and I find it harder to argue around every time I try, is that the United States misdiagnosed the phase of competition it had entered. American leadership assumed the decisive battles would occur at the highest technological edge alone: advanced AI models, cutting-edge chips, frontier software. China competed there too, but simultaneously expanded control over the manufacturing substrate underneath modern life: batteries, grid equipment, processed rare earths, commercial shipping, industrial chemicals, mid-tier semiconductors, solar supply chains. The substrate matters because advanced economies still run on physical systems. AI models don't deploy themselves. Data centers require transformers. EVs require batteries. Satellites require precision manufacturing. Militaries require shipyards. Energy transitions require minerals and processing capacity at continental scale. And this is where the counter-argument starts collapsing under its own assumptions. Washington often frames dependence on Chinese industrial systems as temporary, a bridge period before reshoring succeeds. But rebuilding industrial depth after decades of offshoring is not like reopening a closed retail store. Supplier ecosystems decay, skilled labor pipelines disappear, tooling expertise ages out, community colleges stop teaching relevant trades. Investors expect software-style returns from industries that mature over 20 years. Meanwhile, China kept compounding. In 2024, Chinese shipbuilders received more commercial orders by tonnage than the United States has produced in entire recent eras. China's refining dominance in several critical minerals crossed levels that Western governments now openly classify as strategic vulnerabilities. The Pentagon itself has warned repeatedly about defense supply chain exposure tied to rare earth processing and electronics manufacturing concentration. That reversal matters. For years, American elites described globalization as a force that would liberalize China politically. Instead, globalization industrialized China physically, while financializing large parts of the West. One side accumulated factories, the other accumulated asset inflation. And yes, America still has cards left. Big ones: the dollar system, elite universities, deep capital markets, software leadership, immigration advantages if it chooses to use them. The issue isn't whether the United States remains powerful. It does. The issue is whether its governing incentives still reward the kind of long-horizon industrial thinking required to stay powerful. So far, the evidence says no, which makes the TikTok hearings feel less like strategy and more like substitution. Political systems unable to produce visible industrial wins drift towards symbolic confrontation because symbolism creates the appearance of action without requiring structural reform. A hearing generates headlines in one afternoon. A machine-tool workforce takes 15 years. That timing difference may be the most important number in this entire story. 1.8 million patents, 7 hours debating TikTok. We started there because the contradiction was never really about patents or social media. It was about institutional focus, about which system still knows how to convert anxiety into production. And by the end of this case, the pattern looks harder to dismiss. China has problems the size of continents: debt, demographics, property bubbles, local government financing stress, youth unemployment. Nobody serious denies any of that. But countries do not need perfect balance sheets to become industrially dominant. Britain wasn't fiscally clean during its imperial expansion. Neither was the United States during its manufacturing ascent after World War II. Industrial power comes from sustained productive concentration. China kept building it while the West debated it. That doesn't mean Beijing won. History is cruel to straight-line predictions. Political rigidity creates its own vulnerabilities. Innovation can suffocate under excessive state control. Frontier breakthroughs still emerge disproportionately from American universities, labs, and private firms. AI leadership remains heavily American. Advanced aerospace remains heavily American. The dollar system still gives Washington extraordinary leverage. But leverage decays when overused. Sanctions work best against states dependent on your systems and incapable of replacement. The more Washington weaponizes access to technology, finance, and supply chains, the stronger the incentive becomes for rivals to build parallel structures. Russia accelerated alternatives after sanctions. China is doing the same at much larger scale. The conclusion I land on is not comfortable, but it's where the data points. America still behaves like technological supremacy is its natural condition. China behaves like supremacy is temporary and must be manufactured every morning. One side protects incumbency. The other compounds capacity. And ordinary people will feel the difference long before politicians admit it. Through higher prices, fragile supply chains, strategic shortages, labor markets split between elite software compensation and hollowed-out industrial regions. The future fight between these systems will not look like the Cold War. It will look like competing operating systems for modern life. Energy, logistics, AI infrastructure, manufacturing, payments, telecom, batteries. Whoever controls the substrate underneath daily life gains leverage over everything above it, which makes the TikTok hearings memorable for the wrong reason. Not because they were meaningless, national security concerns are real, but because they revealed a political class far more comfortable interrogating an app than rebuilding an industrial base. That's easier television. My prediction is specific enough to test. Within 10 years, the United States will discover that the hardest part of competing with China is not inventing better technology. It is rebuilding the human and industrial systems required to produce that technology at scale inside its own borders. And if that realization arrives too late, America may still lead the world's most advanced innovations while depending on geopolitical rivals to manufacture the century built around them. Find a flaw in this argument. Seriously, I want to see it.